So Kevin is the Vice President of Telecom and Information Systems for the Marine Spill Response Corporation, and as we fondly know them, MSRC'S. So it's one of the larger oil spill response organizations. He's also the Program Manager of MSRC's Surveillance and Remote Sensing Services. What I find particularly interesting is prior to his employment at MSRC, he actually worked as at the White House Communications Agency, providing telecommunications support for the President, Vice President, First Lady, and Secret Service. So expecting big things here, Kevin.
Okay.
Thank you.
No pressure there. Thanks, Maria. Can everybody see my screen and hear me okay? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, we're good. All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As always, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group. So again, thank you to OSPR and Chevron for the invitation. When Judd originally approached me, he asked me if I could speak to the use of drones on train derailments. And there was a couple of reasons that I actually had to change my talking points. One, that we have a relatively youthful internal drone program and have yet to respond to any train derailments and therefore haven't flown. So I didn't feel that I was in a good position to speak to that. So in lieu of that, I decided that we would do a comparison today of the Aerostats versus the small unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS. So what I could do is start out with an overview of both of these platforms, talk about some of the logistical complexities, the pilot observer certification requirements, the operational considerations for each of these platforms, and then look at some case studies, you know, the real world applications of the science and the technology being presented during this workshop. So, and finally, I'll close with tethered drones. We've been doing some studies on tethered drones and whether there were potential replacement for our aerostats. And I'll let you know where we are in that project. All right, so let's talk about the components of an aerostat. Let's start out with a base unit. The base unit contains the tether line and the winch. Also has a Wi-Fi radio. In this particular system, all communications from the base unit to the aerostat, the balloon, are via Wi-Fi. So the base unit also has a battery pack. So right out the gate, we're fully independent. We can deploy without any external power source. We will need to get a generator or AC power at some point because the battery pack doesn't last forever. And we also, in that base unit, are 5 bottles of helium. Typically, it takes roughly a little under 4, I think, to fully fill the balloon. And then we always carry extra helium bottles, especially if it's going to be a long response, because typically you have to top off the helium on occasion. The next component is the balloon, but to be more accurate, it's really a cross between a balloon and a kite, and it's known as a helikite. And you can actually see the kite that's attached to the rear of the picture of the balloon there, and that really is what helps orient the balloon into the wind. And then the most important component is really the gimbal that contains our sensors, the HD thermal cameras. It also has an AIS receiver and the Wi-Fi radio again, so that we've got that communications path from the gimbal down to the base unit. And the final component is the tablet. This is what the operator uses to control the cameras and the gimbal. He basically just swipes right, left, up, or down to reposition where he wants the cameras to look at. And we can produce raw video, and by raw video, I mean just that. There's no metadata attached to it. Or we can provide screenshots, and that does contain the metadata, and both of those can be readily distributed. We also have the ability to overlay what the cameras are looking at onto a nautical chart, and I'll show you an example of that in a few more slides. But this also gives you the opportunity to see any other AIS-equipped vessels that might be in the area. All right, so let's look at some of the operational considerations for the aerostat. First is airspace restrictions. We're required to file a NOTAM, notice to airmen, 24 hours in advance of a flight. We have in the past gotten a NOTAM pushed through in 3 to 4 hours for an emergency, so it is possible. And then there's also the question of whether there's a temporary flight restriction in effect, in which case we would probably be coordinating all of our sorties with the Air Operations Branch. Another consideration is weather and wind. Now, the aerostat is pretty tolerant. It can fly in winds of up to 34 knots. It can accept light to moderate rain. Torrential downpour, probably we would bring it in at that point. And snow can be a problem. And I'll give you an example on one of the case studies where that actually was. But as you can imagine, with a surface area, the balloon itself is 12 feet by 9 feet. And it wouldn't take much snow to stick to the exterior before you started to add more weight than it can support on its own. So. And we're always cognizant of the cloud ceiling, as we must stay at least 500 feet below that ceiling. And the other consideration is the availability of helium. It's not something that I never thought about until I called and a distributor said that they didn't have any. And the way that it works is that these distributors get allocated a certain amount, I guess it's quarterly. And once they've sold it, they cannot get any more until the next quarter becomes available and they get their next delivery. So you have to keep that in mind, and we keep quite a bit of helium in bottles ready to go. Just for that case, we can go at least a week as we're trying to set up a supply chain. As far as transportation, less than 440 pounds requires no special handling. Between 440 and 1,001 pounds, it requires special training and labeling, but that can be accomplished internally. And then greater than 1,001 pounds requires a CDL driver with the hazmat endorsement. So just some of the things to consider when you're moving the aerostat. All right, so what's our operational strategy? Well, we use it as a tactical tool. We have deployed it from a variety of platforms, from just putting it on the ground to the back of a stake bed truck, and obviously some of our big blues, the oil spill response vessels. We can fly up to 500 feet. We have typically it takes us 4 to 5 personnel to deploy the aerostat, and most of that is just in the actual inflation of the balloon itself. If you can imagine on the back of the helo deck or in any location where there's some wind and you've got a 12 by 9 foot basically sail while you're trying to fill it up with helium, it takes a few people to kind of manage that and get it filled and put back into the cradle. So, and obviously, our mission is to direct the on-water resources to the thickest oil. And that, again, that can be pretty quickly disseminated to other entities within that area. So at this point, I'll stop and I'll talk a little bit about the pictures here. And these were taken from an aerostat during Oil on Water in 2015 in Norway. And the top image is an HD image. And as you can see from the aerostat, it looks like just one big slick. And so if you were trying to direct your on-water assets, it would be a little difficult really where to pinpoint them to be. But when you use the thermal image, it becomes much more evident that these blacker areas are the thicker oil, and that's where you should be pointing the skimming assets. So key advantages, it is transportable both over the road and by air, and we have flown it to, I'll talk about this in a case study for a job up in Newfoundland. There is no pilot certifications required. Again, we're using it to differentiate actionable oil from sheen. Has a medium range with high accuracy. So by medium range, I mean that we can typically detect oil at 3 to 4 miles, but to determine actionable from sheen, we're really talking 3,000 to 4,000 feet. The more nadir of the look angle for the thermal camera, the more accurate it is in determining actionable versus sheen. 12-hour hang time. Again, no power or control data or imagery data is going through the tether. So there is a battery that sits in the tail of the aerostat, and that has to be swapped out every 12 hours. Day and night operations, no waiver required. However, at night we do have a strobe on top of the aerostat, and every 50 feet above 150 feet, the tether has to be lit so it can be well seen. And again, we're tracking the oil. All right, so this is just a couple pictures. One on the left is one of our response vessels where we're just in the process of deploying the aerostat. And as you can see, there's probably 4 or 5 folks up there. And the right-hand side, I had mentioned earlier, where we have the ability to overlay this information onto a nautical chart. So you can see, it might be a little bit difficult for you to see on your screen, but here's the crosshairs right here. And that corresponds on the chart to the same point here. And I mentioned earlier about the metadata that's available on the screenshots. So here's the crosshairs, here's your lat and long, here's your heading information, the RF link between the balloon and the base, battery, and also have a kind of like a wind gauge and also a tension meter on the tether, so that if we start to see orange and red, we realize we're hitting the edge of our parameters and we need to bring it down. All right, so here's a few case studies that are non-oil spill related, but pretty interesting applications for this product or for this tool. The first being a customer after Hurricane Harvey needed to be able to monitor the repair of multiple storage tanks where the floating roofs had failed. And so we took the aerostat over and we flew it over multiple tanks while these, as you can see, they had both product and water sitting on top of these roofs, and they had to be pumped off. So we flew the aerostat and allowed them to monitor that pumping operation. And then the bottom picture is another a job for a customer where the tank farm was sitting next to a river that was at a flood stage. And the concern was that if the water got any higher, that it might breach the berms and actually potentially float one of these tanks. So we parked the aerostat up on a ridge that overlooked the tank farm and monitored that at night for them. And you can just see, it's easy to see the level of the product in the tank, the differentiation just because of the temperature. You can see temperature differentiation. So it was a pretty interesting job. And I had mentioned this one. This was for an international customer who needed to repair an offshore pipeline and needed to be able to monitor just in case there was any oil leakage while they made this repair. And so you can see the skimming, they are all set to start skimming if there was such an incident, which there wasn't, but there were challenging weather conditions there, cold temperatures, and as I mentioned, snow. And we actually had to bring the balloon down a couple times because it was a wet snow and it was sticking to the top of the balloon. And like I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of margin for error as far as the amount of excess payload that balloon can handle. So the snow starts to add weight, and then it starts to get a little saggy in the sky, and you realize it needs to come down and cleaned off. So. All right, so here is an actual incident where we used it for oil spill related scenario. This was a barge collision in the Houston Ship Channel, and the product was Reformit, and that's a gasoline blending stock, and it's very difficult to see. So the guys, the on-water skimming assets were really struggling trying to find where to place themselves to be the most effective. So we activated the aerostat and we flew 24/7 for about 4 or 5 days, directing on-water assets to the thickest part of the slick. And you can see in this video or in this picture just how well the IR camera picked up the product and made it very easy for the guys to direct our on-water assets. All right. So we'll move on to the small unmanned aircraft systems, drones. MSRC has historically relied on contract drone services, but in 2020, we decided to bring more of those services in-house. So as of this moment, we have 11 drones, several of them with dual sensors, 4K and IR. We have one stationary tethering system, and we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. We have 8 Part 107 certified pilots and 3 more in the pipeline. We have a custom video streaming box that allows up to 10 multiple streaming sessions simultaneously. It also allows us to modify the frame rate and the resolution to kind of match whatever bandwidth we have to get it out from the location that we're flying. And then we also have a really good drone management system that allows us to create flight plans, log our flight hours, log our maintenance, and also can assist in the processing of the data collected. This just depicts where we currently have our resources. The blue indicates where the MSRC drones and pilots are, and the orange indicates contracted resources. So as you can see, I think we have the coast pretty well covered, and as well as Honolulu. All right, some of the operational considerations for the drone. Obviously, you need to be Part 107 certified, and you need a trained observer. Transportation of the drones via commercial air can be a bit of a challenge, as FAA has restrictions on lithium-ion batteries. Some of the smaller drones that have batteries that are under 160 watt hours, you can pack in your carry-on luggage. But anything larger than that, you'll need to ship via FedEx or UPS, or actually purchase the batteries locally if possible. Airspace restrictions, again, altitude max is at 400 feet, which is 100 foot less than the Aerostat. There's a couple of pretty good apps out there that can provide you with guidance as far as, are you in a location where you can legally fly your drone? And if you know you're in controlled airspace, you can use the low altitude authorization and notification capability system, which gets you real-time clearance if you're in controlled airspace. It's a good process, and it'll give you the prescribed altitude that you'll have clearance to fly at. As always, if it's a significant response, you'll have multiple air resources out there between, it could be drones, it could be fixed wing, might have dispersant operations. So in that particular case, there probably will be a temporary flight restriction in place, and most of these air operations would be coordinated through the air operations branch. Weather conditions, drones aren't quite as tolerant of the wind, of the rain and the snow. The wind, some of the wind that these drones can handle 20 to 25 knots. But certainly rain and snow is not something that they can tolerate. And again, they must stay at least 500 feet below the clouds. Last but not least, and something I think that is really important, is the chain of custody. You need to determine upfront who's going to have access to this data. And that's something that we do in writing. And if it changes, we get it in writing. So that's just to make sure that the information is getting to the people that needs to, and not getting to the people that it doesn't need to be. So. All right, so operational strategy for the drones, we can deploy from a MSRC vessel, as you can see in the picture to the left, or a vessel of opportunity. Again, you still need a certified pilot and a trained observer. It's performing a similar mission as the Aerostat. We're going to locate and stay in the thick oil, and then we're going to disseminate that information to the on-water skimming assets. And it's also effective for SCAD operations. Again, daytime operations does not need a waiver, but certainly nighttime does. And again, the capability for live streaming for real-time situational awareness. All right, so let me just set this case study up. This is something that we just did back in December. And MSRC was evaluating a new aerial sensor that we were in a fixed wing aircraft. And I worked with Oscar Garcia. He was so kind to come out and give us some help in setting up a really good evaluation using other resources such as satellite imagery, Oscar's drone, and actual on-water measurements. So I'm gonna, and this video is compliments of Oscar, so thank you, Oscar. I shortened it up a little bit. It's just about a minute, but and this again, this is off the coast of California, the Santa Barbara Natural Seeps. And let me see if I can get this to play. So this is Oscar's, this is aerial imagery from Oscar's drone. And you can see some of the sheen and some of the thicker strands of oil. And that's our 65-foot fast response vessel. I think Oscar is standing in the middle of the deck there. There's some more sheen. And now here's a good view of it with a thermal view inset there with the optical. And again, it helps you discern where the thicker strands of oil are. And it's particularly evident here where you've got the sun glint. And I think someone was mentioning the sun glint earlier presentations and the ability to use the IR to see where the oil's at. And this is just taking a measurement of the actual physical measurement of the oil thickness, but actually that should be thickness. Sorry about that. I just noticed that. And again, with the inset of the thermal camera. And again, the thermal being able to pick out the thicker strands of oil there. So it was a really good couple of days, a lot of good testing. It went well. And my thanks again to Oscar for sharing this video with us. Let me see if I can get onto the next screen. Okay. So that takes us to the tethered drone. And again, there's basically two categories. One are free flying drones that can be attached to a tether system. And the other are drones that were designed only to fly in a tether. They have no free flying capabilities. So obviously there's some advantages to the tethered drone in that they can stay airborne almost indefinitely as the power, control, and sensor data is all routed through the tether. And you really don't need advanced flying skills. So the ease of use is better. And they also dramatically reduce the technical and human error crashes in flight. Of note, you still are required to have a pilot certification, and you would still need a night waiver from the FAA. So as I said, we have been researching the tethered drones as a potential replacement for Aerostats. And the criteria that we basically compared our criteria with that we currently have with the Aerostat, and that they must be all weather, and they must be able to fly in up to 34 knots and handle sea states of 4 to 6 feet. And one of the reasons for that is, you know, when you're out at sea, if that sea state, sometimes you can have some quick changes in the actual elevation as the ship is going up and down over the waves. And when you start to use the tether, it starts to drag on the drone rather than the drone flying itself. They start to compete against each other, and then that becomes a problem. So we had multiple vendors lined up to demo their systems at 2020, but like a lot of the folks given their presentations, a lot of things were canceled or delayed because of COVID. We did, however, get one test done in January. It was particularly interesting to me because of a couple of reasons. One, it was a low-cost, all-weather drone, and it was a free-flying drone that was using a third-party tether system. And they had tested this system on land, and we're very confident that they would have a successful test with us offshore. Unfortunately for them, they need to make some additional engineering design flaws, as one drone went back in multiple pieces in a box and the second drone got wet. So, but they weren't discouraged. They were going to go back, make some engineering changes, and they want to come back out with us and test it again. So I know that there are systems on the market today that can ultimately perform as well or better than the Aerostat in an offshore environment, but the issue is cost. The picture depicted on the left-hand side of the screen here is a system that was put together for the US Navy. And its main purpose was to basically fly at 500 feet with some type of a communications repeater that would enhance the footprint of their communications capabilities.
Kevin, we're just about at time right now.
Okay, this is the last slide.
Okay, thank you.
And this is about a $500,000 system. So we know there's other systems out there that are a lower cost, and we're hoping to again continue the testing once we get COVID behind us. And hopefully the next time in a couple of years, I'll be able to update you on where we're at with that program. And that's it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I think we may have time for one very short question.
The tethered drone does not require a certified pilot. I've been told the FAA requires one, but this may be wrong.
My understanding is that it is required. Tethered drones still require a Part 107 certification.
Great. Well, thank you so much.